The United States Capitol building emptied after midnight, its marble corridors echoing with the distant hum of industrial floor buffers and the soft clink of cleaning carts. Senator Jack Thornton sat alone in his private office on the third floor, reviewing polling numbers that confirmed what everyone already knew. At 42, he was the Republican Party's rising star, destined for the White House within a decade. His chiseled jawline had graced the cover of Time magazine twice in 3 years, and his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suits cost more than most Americans earned in a month. The son of a Virginia tobacco fortune, Jack had never known struggle, never questioned his path, never noticed the invisible people who kept his world pristine. Tonight, like every night, he would leave his office without a single glance at the woman who would spend the next 3 hours erasing every trace of his existence from the mahogany desk, the imported rugs, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the National Mall. Lucia Morales pushed her cleaning cart past Senator Thornton's office at 2:47 a.m., her rubber-soled shoes silent on the polished marble. She wore the same navy blue uniform as the other night cleaners, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands rough from years of industrial solvents and disinfectants. The other senators' offices were already locked and dark, but Thornton's light still burned. He always worked late, always left mountains of paper scattered across every surface, always departed without acknowledging her presence even when they passed in the hallway. Lucia didn't mind being invisible. Invisibility was useful when you needed to disappear from a life that had shattered beyond repair. She emptied his trash with practiced efficiency, noting the discarded drafts of his infrastructure speech, the takeout containers from Charlie Palmer's Steakhouse, the crumpled note from his chief of staff, Amanda Prescott, written in looping cursive. What the powerful discarded revealed more than what they chose to display, a lesson Lucia had learned in another life, in another country, before everything had burned to ash. The manila folder in Lucia's locker, hidden beneath her spare uniforms and a photo of her teenage twins, contained 6 months of carefully documented evidence that would either save a senator's career or destroy it. She had collected it piece by piece from another senator's office. Senator Bill Morrison's trash, his printer's discard tray, his recycling bin filled with practiced drafts of documents that shouldn't exist. Tomorrow morning, the Senate Ethics Committee would convene to investigate allegations that Jack Thornton had accepted $3.2 million in illegal campaign contributions from defense contractors seeking to influence his votes on military spending bills. Morrison had leaked the evidence to the Washington Post 3 weeks ago, and Jack's poll numbers had collapsed overnight, his presidential ambitions reduced to a punchline on late-night television. What nobody knew, what nobody suspected, was that the cleaning lady who emptied Morrison's trash every night had spent 12 years as a CIA intelligence analyst specializing in document forensics, and she had recognized a forgery the moment she saw one. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Senator Jack Thornton stepped out of his black Cadillac Escalade at 6:45 a.m., his Secret Service detail flanking him as he strode toward the Senate entrance. The Washington Post headline screamed from every newsstand, "Thornton hearing today. Career on the line as Ethics Committee convenes." His chief of staff, Amanda Prescott, walked 2 steps behind him, her Prada heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her blonde hair perfect despite the humid September morning. Amanda had been his closest advisor for 3 years, his girlfriend for 2, though they kept the relationship secret to avoid political complications. She whispered urgently into his ear about last-minute strategy, about which senators on the committee might be sympathetic, about the backup plan if everything went wrong. Jack barely heard her. His mind was calculating survival odds, planning his next move if he lost his Senate seat, considering whether private sector lobbying could satisfy the ambition that had driven him since prep school at Choate. The marble corridors of the Russell Senate office building felt like a tomb as Jack walked toward his office. Passing staff members who averted their eyes and colleagues who suddenly remembered urgent appointments elsewhere. His father had called at 5 a.m. from the family estate in Charlottesville, his voice cold with disappointment that stung worse than any public scandal. 3 major donors had already requested their contributions be returned, and the Republican National Committee had quietly removed his name from the list of potential presidential candidates for 2028. Amanda squeezed his hand when they reached his office door, a rare public display of affection that felt more like a goodbye than support. She had her own reputation to protect, her own political future to consider. And everyone in Washington knew that loyalty only extended as far as the next election cycle. Jack's office was immaculate, as always. The cleaning crew had left everything perfectly arranged, his desk clear except for a single folder of briefing materials Amanda had prepared. He sank into his leather chair, the same chair his mentor Senator Howard had given him when Jack first won a seat at age 36, and stared at the framed photos on his credenza, his Yale graduation, his first campaign victory, his handshake with the president at a Rose Garden ceremony, his family's tobacco plantation where 5 generations of Thorntons had built their fortune. The American dream had come easily to Jack Thornton. Too easily, his critics said, pointing to his trust fund and family connections as proof he'd never earned anything himself. Now that dream was unraveling, because Senator Bill Morrison, a 72-year-old Democratic warhorse from Ohio, had decided Jack's rising star threatened the established order. Morrison had served in the Senate for 34 years, chaired 3 powerful committees, and collected enough favors to bury anyone who challenged his authority. Amanda closed the office door and perched on the edge of Jack's desk, her expression shifting from advisor to girlfriend in the privacy of their sanctum. "We could leak Morrison's affair with that lobbyist," she suggested, her voice carrying the calculating tone that made her invaluable in Washington's political warfare. Jack shook his head. Fighting dirty only worked if you won, and right now he was losing badly. The documents Morrison had provided to the Ethics Committee looked devastatingly authentic. Bank transfers from defense contractor shell companies, emails discussing quid pro quo arrangements, meeting notes that seemed to prove Jack had sold his vote for campaign cash. Jack's lawyers had examined every page and found nothing obviously forged, nothing that would exonerate him in the court of public opinion, even if technically legal. The hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m., giving him exactly 7 hours to find a miracle or prepare a resignation speech. The intercom buzzed. Jack's legislative director needed to discuss the infrastructure bill amendments. His communications director wanted approval for a press statement. His scheduler was fielding calls from reporters requesting interviews after the hearing. Jack waved them all away, suddenly exhausted by the machinery of his own ambition. Amanda's phone chirped with text messages from her network of Capitol Hill insiders, each one reporting new developments in the scandal that was consuming Jack's career. A Fox News anchor had called for his resignation. 3 Republican senators had issued statements questioning his judgment, and the Virginia Republican Party chairman had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss finding a new candidate for Jack's seat in the next election. Outside his window, protesters had already gathered on the Capitol lawn, holding signs demanding accountability from corrupt politicians. The irony wasn't lost on Jack. He'd actually turned down the bribes Morrison claimed he'd accepted, but in Washington, perception was reality and he was perceived as guilty. "We fight," Amanda declared, standing up and smoothing her skirt with a decisive gesture she used before going into battle. Morrison made a mistake somewhere. He always does when he gets cocky. "We find it, we expose it. We turn this around before 2 p.m. Jack admired her confidence, even as he doubted her strategy. Morrison was too careful, too experienced, too protected by decades of accumulated power. Amanda had already tried everything. Hired private investigators to dig into Morrison's finances, pressured friendly journalists to question the leaked documents, called in favors from allies on the Ethics Committee. Nothing had worked because Morrison's attack was too well planned, too thoroughly documented, too perfectly timed to destroy Jack's career at the moment of his greatest promise. The old guard was teaching the young upstart a lesson about respecting the hierarchy, and the lesson was brutal. Jack's phone rang, his mother, calling from the family estate where she was hosting a garden party for Virginia's Republican donor class. He let it go to voicemail, unable to face her questions or her faith that her son couldn't possibly be guilty of what everyone said he'd done. Amanda paced the office, her mind visibly working through scenarios and strategies, while Jack stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was how careers ended in Washington. Not with dramatic scandal or heroic last stand, but with a slow suffocation of credibility until even your allies stopped returning your calls. The morning sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like his disintegrating political future. In 7 hours, he would walk into the Senate Ethics Committee hearing room and face the consequences of crimes he hadn't committed but couldn't prove he hadn't done. Outside in the hallway, the sound of a cleaning cart rattled past. Someone from a maintenance staff working late or starting early, invisible and irrelevant to the drama unfolding in Senator Thornton's office. Jack had never noticed a night cleaning crew, never thought about the people who scrubbed his floors and emptied his trash, never considered that invisibility might be a choice rather than a condition. Amanda checked her watch and announced she needed to meet with the legal team one more time before the hearing, promising to return with new ideas for their defense. She kissed him quickly, professionally, and swept out of the office in a cloud of Chanel No. 5, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and his dwindling options. The clock on his wall ticked toward 2 p.m. with the inexorable rhythm of a countdown, and Jack Thornton had no miracle, no strategy, and no hope. Lucia Morales stood in the employee locker room in the Capitol building's basement, changing out of her cleaning uniform at 7:30 a.m. after her night shift. Her back ached from 8 hours of pushing industrial floor buffers and hauling bags of trash, but she moved with practiced efficiency, hanging her navy blue work clothes in her locker beside the framed photo of her twins. Isabella and Miguel, 16 years old now, brilliant and beautiful despite the grief that had shaped their adolescence when their father died in Syria 4 years ago. Lucia's husband, Daniel, had been a CIA case officer, killed by a car bomb in Damascus while meeting with an intelligence source, and his death had shattered the carefully constructed life Lucia had built as one of the agency's top document forensics analysts. She had left the CIA not because she couldn't do the work anymore, but because she couldn't bear to be in the building where everyone knew her as the widow, couldn't stand the pitying looks or the assumption that her career had ended along with her marriage. The Capitol cleaning job paid $18.50 an hour, barely enough to cover rent on their small apartment in Alexandria, but the night shift meant Lucia was home when the twins left for school and back before they went to bed. She worked alongside women from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, women who had crossed deserts and risked everything for the chance to clean toilets in the building where laws were made about people like them. They called her La Profesora because she helped their children with homework on breaks, teaching algebra and chemistry in the supply closet between mopping floors. Nobody at the Capitol knew that Lucia had a master's degree in forensic linguistics from Georgetown, that she had testified in federal court about forged documents in terrorism cases, that she had developed analysis techniques the CIA still used to authenticate intelligence reports. She was just another invisible brown woman in a blue uniform, pushing a cart through marble hallways while senators debated immigration reform. Lucia pulled on jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt, her one visible connection to her former life, and checked her phone for messages from the twins. Isabella had texted at 6 a.m. "Mom, did you see the news about Senator Thornton? Isn't he the one whose office you clean?" Miguel's message followed seconds later. "The evidence against him looks fake. You should tell him." Her children were too smart for their own good, raised in a household where dinner conversations had involved discussing CIA tradecraft and intelligence analysis until the day their father died. They knew their mother saw patterns others missed, noticed details that revealed truths hidden beneath surfaces, and they trusted her judgment even when she was emptying trash cans instead of briefing senior officials. Lucia had noticed the evidence against Senator Thornton looked fake, too. She'd recognized the forgery signatures the moment Morrison's leaked documents appeared in the Washington Post 3 weeks ago. The manila folder in her locker contained printouts of every suspicious document she collected from Senator Morrison's office over the past 6 months. Lucia had initially noticed a pattern while emptying Morrison's recycling bin. Practice drafts with timing errors, emails with metadata that didn't match their supposed creation dates, memos with font inconsistencies that screamed forgery to anyone trained to look. She had started collecting evidence out of professional habit, the same instinct that had made her one of the CIA's best analysts, unable to ignore anomalies even when she was just trying to do an honest day's work for honest pay. The folder now contained enough proof to destroy Morrison's conspiracy, but Lucia had hesitated for weeks about what to do with it. She was nobody now, just a cleaning lady whose testimony would be dismissed as the fantasies of an immigrant janitor with delusions of importance. Her shift supervisor, Maria, called out from across the locker room, asking if Lucia wanted overtime this weekend for a special cleaning project in the Senate chamber. Lucia shook her head. Weekends belonged to the twins, to soccer games and grocery shopping, and the normal rhythms of single parenthood that kept her grounded in reality. Maria nodded sympathetically. She knew about Daniel's death, knew Lucia was raising twins alone, knew the night shift was chosen deliberately to maximize time with her children. The other cleaners respected Lucia's privacy, her quiet dignity, her willingness to take the worst assignments without complaint. They didn't know she was working beneath her education level by choice, that she could walk away tomorrow and return to the CIA with a six-figure salary if she wanted to go back to that world. Lucia closed her locker and headed for the exit, the manila folder tucked in her backpack alongside her lunch containers and the library books she'd checked out for Isabella's English class. The folder felt heavier than it should, weighted with the knowledge of what it contained and the choice she had to make in the next few hours. Senator Thornton's hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. She'd overheard Amanda Prescott discussing on the phone while Lucia cleaned the office 3 nights ago, Amanda's voice carrying a particular edge of panic that came from watching a carefully built career collapse. Lucia had no loyalty to Jack Thornton. He'd never acknowledged her existence despite her cleaning his office 5 nights a week for 11 months. But she had developed a visceral hatred of injustice during her CIA years, watching innocent people destroyed by lies while guilty parties escaped accountability. The September morning air hit Lucia's face as she exited the Capitol building, the humidity already building toward the swampy heat that made Washington unbearable in late summer. She walked toward the metro station, passing senators and staffers streaming toward the Capitol for the day's business, invisible to them as she became invisible to most of official Washington. Her phone buzzed with another text from Miguel. "Mom, seriously, that evidence is fake. I showed it to Isabella, and she agrees. You have to do something." Lucia smiled despite her exhaustion. Her children had inherited their father's sense of justice and their mother's analytical mind, a dangerous combination in teenagers who believed the world could be made right through evidence and truth. They were wrong, of course. Washington didn't run on truth. It ran on power and perception and the ability to destroy your enemies before they destroyed you. At the metro entrance, Lucia stopped and pulled out the manila folder, staring at the evidence that could save a senator's career or ensure her own irrelevance if she tried and failed. A small voice in her head, the voice that sounded like Daniel, the voice she'd been trying to silence for 4 years, whispered that some fights were worth the risk, that justice mattered more than invisibility, that her training and skills were too valuable to waste on cleaning other people's offices. Lucia checked her watch, 8:15 a.m. She had 5 hours and 45 minutes to decide if she was ready to stop being invisible, to step back into a world that had taken everything from her, to risk the fragile peace she'd built for herself and her children. The folder felt like a bomb in her hands, capable of destroying Morrison or destroying her, and Lucia Morales had to choose which explosion she could live with. Senator Bill Morrison sat in his Capitol Hill office at 9 a.m., savoring his morning coffee, and the front page of the Washington Post that detailed Jack Thornton's impending destruction. Morrison's office was twice the size of Thornton's, decorated with photographs from 34 years in the Senate, handshakes with 5 presidents, ribbon cuttings for bridges named his honor, pose shots with union leaders and corporate executives who'd funneled millions into his campaign coffers. At 72, Morrison had outlasted 3 generations of ambitious young senators who'd challenged his authority, and Thornton was just the latest upstart who needed to learn that Washington belonged to those who'd paid their dues. The fabricated evidence had taken Morrison's team 6 months to create, working with a sophisticated document forger who'd previously helped foreign intelligence services create plausible disinformation. It had cost Morrison $400,000 from a secret slush fund, but destroying Thornton before he became a serious presidential threat was worth every penny. Morrison's chief of staff brought in the latest polling data, showing Thornton's approval rating had dropped 32 points in 3 weeks, making him toxic to Republican donors and vulnerable to a primary challenge. Morrison smiled. The beauty of the forgery was its plausibility, built on Thornton's actual meetings with defense contractors, but twisted with fake bank transfers and fabricated quid pro quo arrangements. Even if Thornton somehow proved the documents were forged, the cloud of suspicion would follow him forever, destroying his presidential ambitions and leaving Morrison's chosen candidates to dominate the 2028 Republican primary. The Ethics Committee hearing was just theater at this point. Morrison had quietly lobbied 3 of the 5 committee members, reminding them of past favors and future consequences. By tonight, Thornton would be finished, and Morrison could return to his real priority, blocking the infrastructure bill that threatened to expose Morrison's own illegal foreign funding. The phone rang. Morrison's contact at the FBI, confirming that the Bureau had opened a preliminary investigation into Thornton based on the leaked documents. Morrison had cultivated relationships throughout Washington's law enforcement and intelligence communities over 3 decades, collecting favors like baseball cards, always ready to call them in when needed. The FBI agent sounded uncomfortable making the call, but Morrison had helped him get promoted twice and knew about his gambling debts. So discomfort was irrelevant. Morrison hung up satisfied. Even if the Ethics Committee somehow cleared Thornton, the FBI investigation would keep the scandal alive through the next election cycle. Politics was about playing the long game, accumulating leverage, knowing which pressure points to squeeze, and when. Morrison's legislative director entered with news that Senator Thornton had requested an emergency meeting with Morrison before the hearing, probably beg for mercy or negotiate a face-saving resignation. Morrison considered refusing. Watching Thornton grovel would be satisfying, but it risked revealing Morrison's involvement in the documents leak. Better to maintain the fiction of neutrality, expressing public sadness about a promising young senator brought down by his own corruption. Morrison instructed his director to decline the meeting politely, suggesting that Morrison couldn't be seen as interfering with the Ethics Committee's independent investigation. The director nodded and left, and Morrison returned to his coffee and his newspaper, relishing the victory that was less than 5 hours away. Amanda Prescott's name appeared on Morrison's call list. Thornton's chief of staff had been calling all morning, trying to reach anyone on the Ethics Committee or anyone with influence over the investigation. Morrison ignored her calls. Amanda was smart and ruthless enough to be dangerous, but she'd hitched her career to Thornton's rising star and would fall with him. Morrison actually respected Amanda's political instincts and had considered recruiting her for his own staff after Thornton's career ended. But her loyalty to Thornton made her untrustworthy. In Washington, loyalty was admirable until it became inconvenient, and Amanda's devotion to saving Thornton was both. Morrison made a mental note to ensure Amanda's reputation suffered alongside Thornton's. Collateral damage was unfortunate, but necessary when sending messages about the price of challenging the establishment. The cleaning crew's night supervisor called Morrison's office asking about a missing recycling bin from 3 weeks ago, a detail so trivial Morrison's scheduler almost hung up. Morrison vaguely remembered the recycling bin disappearing and being replaced, one of those minor inconveniences that barely registered amid Senate business. His scheduler assured the supervisor it wasn't a problem and ended the call, never thinking to mention it to Morrison. In the grand scheme of Morrison's conspiracy against Thornton, a missing recycling bin was less than irrelevant. It was invisible, like the cleaning crews themselves, like all the people who maintained the Capitol building while senators made history. Morrison returned to reviewing his afternoon schedule, which included the Thornton hearing, followed by a fundraiser with pharmaceutical executives, followed by dinner with the minority leader to discuss next year's committee assignments. Morrison's phone buzzed with a text from his document forger, a former NSA analyst who'd gone private after being forced out for ethical violations. The forger wanted to know if Morrison needed any follow-up documents to reinforce the case against Thornton, perhaps more emails or bank records that could be discovered if Thornton mounted an unexpectedly strong defense. Morrison declined. Too many documents would look suspicious, and the existing evidence was overwhelming enough to destroy Thornton's career and reputation. The forger's final text was a reminder that his $400,000 payment had purchased absolute silence. Morrison wasn't worried. The forger had his own criminal exposure and knew that exposing Morrison would mean exposing himself. Mutually assured destruction was the most reliable form of loyalty in Washington. At 11 a.m., Morrison's scheduler brought lunch from the Senate dining room, Maine lobster salad and iced tea, eaten at his desk while reviewing briefing materials for afternoon meetings. The Thornton situation had consumed 3 weeks of Morrison's time and significant resources, but the payoff was worth it, removing a potential rival while demonstrating Morrison's power to anyone else considering a challenge. Morrison had survived in the Senate by being smarter, more ruthless, and more patient than his opponents, and Jack Thornton had underestimated all 3 qualities. The hearing would begin in 3 hours. Thornton would be humiliated, and Morrison's authority would be reinforced for another election cycle. Outside Morrison's window, the Capitol dome gleamed white in the September sun, a symbol of American democracy that Morrison had learned to manipulate with the skill of a concert pianist. He finished his lobster and checked his watch, counting down a moment when Jack Thornton's political career would end and Morrison's would continue uninterrupted. Lucia Morales stood in the Capitol building's main hallway at 11:45 a.m., her hands gripping the manila folder so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She had spent the morning at home, dropping the twins at school and sitting at her kitchen table staring at the evidence she collected from Morrison's office. Isabella and Miguel had argued with her before leaving for school, insisting she had a moral obligation to expose Morrison's conspiracy, reminding her that their father had died believing justice mattered more than personal safety. Daniel's photo watched in the refrigerator, his smile frozen in a moment before Syria, before the bomb, before everything changed. Lucia had made her decision while washing breakfast dishes, accepting that she couldn't live with herself if she let an innocent man's career be destroyed by lies she could prove were lies. The problem was access. Lucia couldn't simply knock on Senator Thornton's door and expect to be taken seriously by a man who'd never acknowledged her existence. She had called his office at 10 a.m. using the Capitol's internal phone system, identifying herself as Lucia Morales with information about the Morrison case, only to be told by his scheduler that the senator wasn't accepting calls from constituents about the hearing. Lucia had tried to explain she worked in the Capitol building, that she had evidence, that it was urgent, but the scheduler had politely dismissed her and hung up. The Senate security protocols meant Lucia couldn't access the senator's private offices during the day without a specific work assignment, and her supervisor had already told her there was no overtime available until the weekend. Lucia had considered going to the Washington Post with her evidence, but journalists would take days to verify her claims, and the hearing started in 2 hours. She thought about contacting the FBI, but her CIA background made her wary of how federal law enforcement handled politically explosive information. Leaks were inevitable, and Morrison had enough connections to bury her testimony before it reached anyone who mattered. Her only option was to intercept Thornton directly, to put the evidence in his hands before he walked into the hearing room, and hope he was smart enough to recognize what he was looking at. The plan was desperate and unlikely to work, but Lucia had learned in the CIA that desperate times required desperate measures, and watching an innocent man destroyed by forgeries offended every principle she'd built her career on. Senator Thornton emerged from his office at 12:15 p.m., flanked by Amanda Prescott and 2 lawyers, heading toward the Senate dining room for a final strategy lunch before the hearing. Lucia stepped forward from where she'd been waiting near the marble columns, her heart pounding, the folder clutched against her chest like a shield. "Senator Thornton," she called out, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I need to speak with you about your hearing." Jack barely glanced in her direction, his mind clearly elsewhere, his expression exhausted. Amanda Prescott, however, stopped and turned, her eyes narrowing with recognition. She'd seen Lucia cleaning Jack's office countless times, but had never bothered to learn her name. "This isn't a good time," Amanda said dismissively, moving to block Lucia's approach. "The senator has an important meeting." Lucia held up the manila folder, her hands trembling slightly but her voice firm. "I have evidence that proves Senator Morrison fabricated the documents against you," she said, loud enough that Jack stopped walking and turned around. "I've been collecting it from his office trash for 6 months, and I can prove every document in the Ethics Committee case is forged." The hallway fell silent. Jack's lawyers exchanged skeptical glances. Amanda's expression shifted from dismissive to hostile, and Jack himself stared at Lucia with the first real attention he'd ever given her. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and desperate hope. Lucia straightened her shoulders, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in 11 months. "I'm the woman who cleans your office every night," she said, "and I used to be a CIA intelligence analyst specializing in document forensics." Amanda laughed, a sharp bark of disbelief that echoed off the marble walls. "This is ridiculous," she said to Jack. "She's a cleaning lady. She's probably working for Morrison to waste our time before the hearing." But Jack was staring at Lucia with an intensity that made her wonder if he finally saw her as a person rather than a ghost who emptied his trash. "What's in the folder?" he asked quietly, ignoring Amanda's objections. Lucia held out to him, her hand steady now. 6 months of Morrison's discarded drafts, practice versions of the forged emails, metadata inconsistencies, printer logs that prove when documents were actually created versus when they claim to have been sent. Everything you need to prove the case against you is a fabrication. Jack reached for the folder, but Amanda intercepted it, flipping through pages with growing skepticism. How did you get access to Morrison's office? Amanda demanded. Lucia met Amanda's hostile gaze without flinching. I clean his office every night at 1 a.m., she said simply. People throw away more truth than they keep, and I was trained to recognize patterns in discarded documents. Morrison's team created practice versions before finalizing the forgeries, and they threw the drafts in recycling bins I empty every night. One of Jack's lawyers, a Harvard-trained partner from Washington's most expensive law firm, took the folder from Amanda and started examining the contents, his expression shifting from skepticism to intense focus. This metadata analysis is sophisticated, the lawyer murmured. If authentic, this proves the emails were created 3 months after they were supposedly sent. Jack grabbed the folder himself, flipping through pages of highlighted text, circled printer codes, spreadsheets tracking document creation times. His hands shook as he realized what he was holding. Why should we trust you? Amanda demanded, her voice sharp with suspicion. You could be working for Morrison. This could be a setup to make the senator look desperate. Lucia had expected this question, had prepared her answer during the sleepless hours before dawn. Because Morrison's conspiracy doesn't just frame Senator Thornton for crimes he didn't commit, she said quietly. The same documents I collected prove Morrison himself has been taking foreign money from Chinese and Russian sources to influence his votes on military contracts and infrastructure spending. The Ethics Committee should be investigating Morrison, not Senator Thornton, and I have enough evidence to prove it. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. Jack's lawyers were frantically examining the folder's contents. Amanda was pulling out her phone to photograph the documents, and Jack himself was staring at Lucia like she materialized from another dimension. Who are you, really? Jack asked again, his voice softer now, genuinely curious beneath the shock. Lucia took a breath, steadying herself for the revelation that would make her visible in ways she'd spent 4 years avoiding. My name is Lucia Morales, she said. I have a master's degree in forensic linguistics from Georgetown University. I worked for 12 years as a CIA intelligence analyst in the Counterintelligence Center, specializing in document authentication and foreign intelligence analysis. I developed 3 of the authentication techniques the agency currently uses to detect forged documents in terrorism cases. I left the CIA 4 years ago when my husband, also an agency officer, was killed in Syria. I took the Capitol cleaning job because the night shift lets me be home with my teenage twins while dealing with grief. She paused, meeting Jack's eyes. And I'm very good at my job, Senator. Both of my jobs. The conference room in Jack Thornton's office had transformed into a war room by 12:45 p.m., with Lucia's evidence spread across a mahogany table, while lawyers, staffers, and Jack himself pored over every page. Lucia sat in a leather chair near the window, feeling surreal about occupying furniture she normally cleaned. Watching Jack's team react to the bombshell she delivered. The Harvard lawyer, his name was Thomas Chun, and he graduated first in his class, kept looking at Lucia with barely concealed amazement, asking technical questions about metadata extraction and printer identification that proved she knew exactly what she was talking about. Amanda Prescott stood in the corner, arms crossed, her expression oscillating between grudging respect and resentment that the cleaning lady she dismissed for 11 months was now the only thing standing between Jack's career and total destruction. This document here, Thomas said, pointing to an email Morrison claimed Jack had sent to a defense contractor, shows it was created using Microsoft Word 2021. But the email header says it was sent in 2019 when that software version didn't exist yet. Lucia nodded, having identified that particular forgery 3 months ago while emptying Morrison's recycling bin. Morrison's forgery was good but not perfect, she explained, her CIA training surfacing in her analytical tone. They matched the font and formatting to Jack's actual emails, but they used current software to create historical documents, and the software leaves digital fingerprints. The printer logs show these were printed in Morrison's office, not Jack's, and the paper stock is different from what the Senate supplies to individual offices. Thomas was photographing every page, building what he called the most important evidence file of my career. Jack sat at the head of the table, his earlier exhaustion replaced by electric energy as he realized he had a path to survival. "How did you learn to do this kind of analysis?" he asked Lucia, genuinely curious about the woman he'd never noticed. Lucia considered her answer carefully, aware that her entire history was about to become public if they used her evidence in the hearing. "The CIA recruited me from Georgetown's graduate program in forensic linguistics," she said. "I started analyzing communications intercepts from terrorist networks, looking for patterns that indicated deception or coordination. Then I moved into document forensics when the agency needed someone who could authenticate leaked documents and identify forgeries from foreign intelligence services. I testified in 3 federal trials, helped prevent 2 major intelligence breaches, and trained analysts of the FBI and NSA in detection techniques." She paused. "I was good at my job because I see patterns other people miss, and I assume nothing is what it appears to be." Amanda's phone buzzed with a text from the Ethics Committee chairman's office, asking if Jack planned to attend the 2 p.m. hearing, or if he was conceding. Jack looked at Thomas, who was still examining Lucia's evidence with the focus of a surgeon. "Can we use this in the hearing?" Jack asked, "Do we have time to authenticate it?" Thomas shook his head. "Authentication would take weeks through proper channels, and Morrison's lawyers will challenge every document's chain of custody. But he looked at Lucia with calculation. If Mrs. Morales testifies to how she collected this evidence, and if we can verify her CIA credentials, her testimony itself becomes the authentication. She's a recognized expert in document forensics, and her analysis will carry more weight than any outside examiner we could hire." Lucia felt her stomach clench. She'd known this moment was coming, but actually facing the prospect of testifying before the Senate Ethics Committee made her CIA training feel very distant. "I'll testify," Lucia said before she could talk herself out of it. "But you need to understand what Morrison will do to discredit me. He'll call me a disgruntled janitor with delusions. He'll question my motives. He'll suggest I'm working for Jack or being paid to lie. He'll make me prove my CIA background, which means calling my former supervisors at Langley and exposing parts of my work history that are still classified." Jack leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Why would you risk that for me?" he asked. "You said I never even noticed you exist. Why help someone who treated you like you were invisible?" Lucia had asked herself the same question all morning, and her answer came from somewhere deeper than professional training or analytical expertise. "Because I watched my husband die fighting for justice," she said quietly, "and I can't watch another person be destroyed by lies when I have the power to stop it." The room fell silent. Even Amanda looked moved by Lucia's words, her hostility softening into something approaching respect. Thomas broke the moment by standing up decisively. "We're doing this," he announced. "We bring Lucia to the hearing. We present her evidence. We put Morrison on defense instead of Jack. It's risky as hell, but it's our only shot." Jack nodded, then turned to Lucia with an expression she'd never seen on his face, gratitude mixed with something that looked like shame. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I'm sorry I never saw you, never acknowledged you, never bothered to learn your name despite you cleaning my office every night for almost a year. You deserve better." Lucia accepted the apology with a small nod, appreciating the sentiment, even if it came only because she'd become useful rather than invisible. Amanda's phone rang, the Ethics Committee chairman calling personally to ask if Jack was prepared to proceed with the hearing. Amanda looked at Jack, who looked at Lucia, who took a deep breath and nodded. "Tell them we'll be there at 2 p.m., Jack said, "and tell them we're bringing a witness they weren't expecting." Amanda made the call while Thomas started briefing Lucia on hearing procedures, warning her that Morrison's lawyers would attack every aspect of her testimony. Lucia listened calmly, her CIA experience with hostile interrogations making Senate lawyers seem less intimidating than they probably should. She had testified in terrorism trials where defense attorneys had tried to destroy her credibility with every legal trick imaginable, and she'd learned to stick to facts, stay calm, and trust that evidence spoke louder than personal attacks. At 1:15 p.m., Jack's team began final preparations for the hearing, with Thomas coaching Lucia on how to present her evidence clearly and Amanda arranging for Senate security to expedite Lucia's credentials so she could enter the hearing room. Jack pulled Lucia aside privately, away from the controlled chaos of his staff. "If this works," he said, "if your testimony saves my career, I want you to know I'll never forget it. And I'll spend the rest of my time in the Senate making sure people like you, people who do essential work while being treated as invisible, get the recognition and respect you deserve." Lucia smiled slightly, appreciating the sentiment even if she suspected Jack's gratitude would fade once the crisis passed. But for now, she had a hearing to prepare for, a conspiracy to expose, and a choice to own. She was stepping back into the light, ready or not. The Senate Ethics Committee hearing room was packed at 1:55 p.m., every seat filled with journalists, staffers, and political observers eager to watch Jack Thornton's career end in public disgrace. Senator Morrison sat in the front row, his expression appropriately solemn, but his eyes gleaming with barely concealed satisfaction. The 5 Ethics Committee senators sat behind an elevated bench, their faces neutral but their body language suggesting they'd already decided Jack's fate before hearing a single word of testimony. Amanda Prescott sat directly behind Jack at the respondents' table, her Prada suit armor against the cameras, her expression carefully composed. And Lucia Morales sat beside Jack's legal team, wearing the only professional outfit she owned, a black pantsuit she'd bought for Daniel's funeral and hadn't worn since, feeling desperately out of place among Washington's power players. The committee chairman, Senator Patricia Walsh from Maine, called a hearing to order at exactly 2 p.m. with the brisk efficiency of someone eager to complete an unpleasant but necessary task. She outlined the charges against Jack, accepting illegal campaign contributions from defense contractors, exchanging votes for money, betraying public trust, and invited Jack's legal team to present their defense. Tom Mischin stood, his Harvard credentials apparent in his confident bearing, and shocked the room by announcing they were calling a witness whose testimony would prove the entire case against Senator Thornton was fabricated. Morrison's head snapped up, his satisfaction replaced by confusion, and the first flicker of concern. The committee's senators exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for a defense that went beyond denying the charges. Thomas called Lucia to testify, and she walked the witness chair with her manila folder, her hand steady despite her racing heart. Senator Walsh administered the oath, and Lucia swore to tell the truth, aware that lie before a Senate committee was a federal crime, but confident she wouldn't need to lie. Thomas began his questioning gently, establishing Lucia's credentials, her master's degree from Georgetown, her 12 years at the CIA, her expertise in document forensics and authentication. Morrison's lawyer objected immediately, arguing that Lucia's qualifications were irrelevant since she was just a cleaning lady with no standing to testify. Senator Walsh overruled the objection, clearly intrigued by where this was heading, and Thomas continued building Lucia's credibility as an expert witness. "Mrs. Morales," Thomas said, "can you explain how you came to be in possession of documents related to this case?" Lucia took a breath and began the story she'd rehearsed, how she cleaned both Senator Thornton's and Senator Morrison's offices, how she'd noticed anomalies in Morrison's discarded documents, how her CIA training had flagged the forgeries as suspicious. She spoke in clear, precise English, her analysis detailed but accessible, her testimony gaining momentum as she explained metadata inconsistencies, printer identification markers, and a timeline that proved Morrison's team had created documents they claimed were years old. The hearing room fell absolutely silent, every person present recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary, a cleaning lady dismantling a senator's conspiracy with the expertise of a CIA analyst. Morrison's face had gone pale, his earlier satisfaction replaced by visible panic as Lucia methodically destroyed his carefully constructed fiction. His lawyer stood repeatedly to object, but Senator Walsh was now completely focused on Lucia's testimony, asking her own questions about how she'd authenticated the documents and verified her findings. Lucia answered every question with calm precision, pulling out specific examples from her folder, Morrison's practice emails with track changes showing how he refined the forgeries, printer logs proving when documents were actually created, metadata showing they'd been backdated to frame Thornton. She explained that Morrison's forger had been skilled but had made fundamental errors visible to anyone trained in forensic document analysis, mistakes that proved the entire ethics committee case was built on lies. Thomas then dropped the second bomb. Lucia's evidence didn't just exonerate Jack. It proved Morrison himself had been accepting foreign bribes from Chinese and Russian sources. Lucia presented documents showing wire transfers from shell companies linked to Beijing and Moscow, emails discussing quid pro quo arrangements for Morrison's votes on military contracts, meeting notes proving Morrison had sold access to foreign governments seeking to influence American defense policy. The hearing room erupted, journalists frantically typing, Morrison's lawyers shouting objections, Senator Walsh demanding order, while her fellow committee members stared at Morrison with expressions ranging from shock to fury. Morrison stood up, his face red, and shouted that Lucia was lying, that she was a disgruntled employee making up stories, that this was a political hit job orchestrated by Jack's team. Senator Walsh gabbled the room to silence and asked a question everyone was thinking. Mrs. Morales, why should this committee believe your analysis over forensic reports already submitted by Senator Morrison's team? Lucia had prepared for this moment, the question her entire credibility hinged on. She pulled out her phone and displayed her CIA credentials, still valid despite her resignation, showing her security clearance level and specialist designation in document forensics. Then she recited the names of 3 federal trials where she'd testified as an expert witness, 2 of which had resulted in terrorism convictions based partially on her document authentication. Finally, she offered to have the committee verify her credentials with the CIA's Office of Congressional Affairs, knowing they would confirm her expertise even if they couldn't discuss her classified work. Senator Walsh made notes, clearly impressed, while Morrison's lawyer frantically argued that Lucia's CIA background made her testimony suspect rather than reliable. Thomas concluded his examination by asking Lucia one final question. Mrs. Morales, in your expert opinion, is there any possibility the documents presented against Senator Thornton are authentic? Lucia looked directly at the committee, her voice steady and certain. No, Senator Chun, she said. I have examined every document in the case against Senator Thornton, using techniques I developed for the CIA. They are sophisticated forgeries created within the last 6 months, not authentic communications from 2019 as claimed. Furthermore, my analysis proves they were created in Senator Morrison's office using his staff's equipment, and then leaked to create the appearance of legitimate scandal. This is not speculation. This is forensic fact based on objective technical analysis. The hearing room exploded again, and this time Senator Walsh let the chaos continue for several seconds before gaveling for order, clearly needing time to process the bombshell that had just detonated her committee's proceedings. Senator Morrison's lawyer demanded a recess to verify Lucia's credentials and review her evidence. Senator Walsh granted a 90-minute break, while committee staff contacted the CIA. Morrison left the room visibly shaken, his confidence collapsing as a conspiracy unraveled. Jack sat stunned, while Thomas and Lucia prepared for the counterattack. Nearby, Amanda Prescott watched Lucia with a mix of admiration and resentment. The cleaning woman she had dismissed had just destroyed Morrison and saved Jack. During the recess, the CIA confirmed Lucia's 12 years of service, her forensic expertise, and her role in developing document authentication techniques still in use. While classified details remained undisclosed, her credibility was firmly established. Thomas explained to Jack that Morrison now faced an ethics investigation and likely criminal charges. Jack struggled to process his career had been saved by someone he had barely noticed despite her cleaning his office nightly. Amanda approached Lucia and offered a stiff apology for trying to have her fired. Lucia calmly replied that Amanda should have treated her like a person instead of furniture. The truth unsettled Amanda, whose phone soon filled with urgent political messages as news of the hearing spread. When the committee reconvened, Senator Walsh announced that Lucia's credentials and evidence were verified. Morrison requested a closed session, but Walsh denied it. Morrison testified publicly, denying everything, but his story unraveled as Thomas presented Lucia's evidence, handwritten notes, emails, and printer logs. Morrison's attempt to discredit Lucia collapsed when he implied she was an untrustworthy immigrant, prompting audible gasps. The final blow came with Senate security footage showing Morrison's chief of staff transporting forged documents to a private examiner. The evidence proved Morrison's direct involvement. Defeated, he slumped in his chair as Walsh cleared Jack of all charges and announced a full investigation into Morrison, referring the case to the Department of Justice. Morrison was stripped of his chairmanships and urged to resign. As chaos erupted, the media narrative flipped instantly. Jack thanked Lucia privately, telling her she had saved everything. Lucia simply asked him to remember that invisible people have dignity and value. As officials outlined her future cooperation with prosecutors, Lucia realized her quiet life was over. Calling her twins, she reassured them, and felt years of grief finally begin to lift. 3 months later, Lucia unpacked boxes in her new office in the Russell Senate Office Building. Jack had offered her the role of chief of staff 2 days after the hearing, replacing Amanda, who had resigned. The salary and authority were substantial, but Lucia accepted because she missed meaningful work and needed financial stability for her twins. Isabella and Miguel thrived after a major newspaper profiled Lucia's story. College recruiters took interest, and both teens considered careers in intelligence or law. Lucia watched them with pride, wishing their father could see them now. Jack visited Lucia's office daily with coffee, their working relationship evolving into a close partnership built on trust and mutual respect. Lucia managed policy and strategy, while Jack handled public leadership. Their bond deepened through shared survival and growth. Morrison resigned soon after, facing federal indictments. Several co-conspirators also fell, creating opportunities Jack capitalized on. At 43, he became chair of the Appropriations Committee and emerged as a serious presidential prospect. His transformation into a more humble leader was genuine. As Lucia became indispensable in legislative negotiations, Washington recognized her influence. Reporters called her the power behind Jack, and the label fit. During one late-night session, Jack confessed he had fallen in love with her. Lucia set firm boundaries, and Jack respected them. Weeks later, Lucia saw Jack treating everyone, from custodial staff to interns, with dignity. That change shifted something in her. After a Capitol event, she kissed him and admitted her feelings. Their relationship grew privately, carefully balanced with professional boundaries. Jack bonded with the twins, and Lucia was welcomed into his family. 6 months after the hearing, Jack proposed at Arlington National Cemetery, honoring Daniel's memory. Lucia accepted, and they married quietly weeks later. At 41, Lucia became pregnant with their daughter as Jack prepared a presidential run. She declined the role of campaign manager, choosing family first. Standing in her office, hand on her belly, Lucia reflected on her journey, from invisibility to purpose, from grief to hope, and knew she had earned every part of her new life.